Speaking of software and disruptive capabilities and disruptions in the economy and all kinds of things like that, I want to welcome with us today our speaker, great timely topic, Adam Lashinsky. As I mentioned, he's a reporter and assistant managing editor at Fortune. He's the editorial director for Fortune's Brainstorm Tech Conference, co-chair of the Fortune Global Forum, author of the 2012 bestseller Inside Apple, and also a regular commentator on Fox News. But the reason that he's here and the reason that we picked him, not knowing everything that was going on with Uber, was he wrote the book Wild Ride, Inside Uber's Quest for World Domination. So please join me in giving Adam Lashinsky a great noblest welcome. Adam. Thanks, sir.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you. Good morning, everybody.
Mic on?
I think so. Is my mic on? Yes. Great. It's wonderful to be here. When Amr handed me the clicker, it reminded me, 2 mornings ago, I was at the Apple event in Cupertino, and I love the moment where the CEO walks off the stage and hands the clicker to the next presenter who's coming on. It's like, as with everything at Apple, it's highly orchestrated, and I watch this clean handoff like a baton on what do they call it? The relays in racing. So anyway, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here. It's very impressive to see all of your accomplishments. I know there's a lot of authors in the room. I'm also an author, but of a very different kind. There's no peer review with my work. My peers edit it, but it's not quite the same thing. And so I'm going to get into in a moment the topic of technology versus business. And I'll give you the preview, which is that you're the technologists, I'm not. And I just want you to know that coming in. I'm here to tell you stories about the business world. I'm happy to talk about the technology behind it with the proviso that that's not my #1 thing. That's your #1 thing. And also to give you a preview for when I'm done. I love having conversations and even debates and dare I say it, around the dinner table arguments. And so I look forward to your questions about anything you like, about Uber, about Apple, and about my 20 years in Silicon Valley as well. The title of my book is Wild Ride. I didn't come up with the title for this book. My editor did. And I had no idea when I started it just what a wild ride it would be. And so I've come to think of the book is Wild Ride, but this presentation is my wild ride. And not just my wild ride on writing a book about Uber and Travis Kalanick, but the wild ride that I've had in almost 30 years now as a journalist, and in particular, the last 20 years in Silicon Valley. This is my LinkedIn profile, just a prompt to, by way of telling you a little bit about myself. I should also tell you that I think I'll be different than what many people are used to. My slides are intended to be pretty pictures. There will be almost no hard data that anybody needs to write down, save for at the very end. These are conversation starters, not information per se. As I said, I've been in Silicon Valley for 20 years. I came in 1997 to write about tech stocks for the San Jose Mercury News, back when regional newspapers really mattered, and the Mercury News was at the center of what was going on in Silicon Valley. High interest on Wall Street in what was happening in Silicon Valley, and high interest in the Valley, I learned, by engineers and scientists and technical people who were all of a sudden, for the first time in their lives, making money. And they wanted to understand the finances of Silicon Valley. I came in as a business generalist and somebody interested in finance to really sit between those two audiences. Before that, I had been in Japan for a year. I started my career here in Washington, D.C., living on Capitol Hill, working for some trade publications. And I had been in Chicago covering general business. I found it tremendously exciting when I got to the San Jose Mercury News, and I went around Silicon Valley introducing myself to people. I found that the finance people were very excited because they hadn't met a journalist at the Mercury News or other places who really wanted to come talk to them about finance, about money. They were used to meeting technophiles and people who wanted to talk about bits and bytes and processor speeds, and I was learning just to talk about those topically, not ever to learn what it really meant. And as I said, the technical people were very hungry for somebody to explain to them where what they did fit into the business sense. And so that's been my stock in trade. I want to try to do one more moment of level setting and tell you that I am never the first onto something. I'm not bleeding edge about anything. And I think that's the right approach for somebody like me. Because if you're on the bleeding edge, you're going to get it wrong more often than not. If you're doing it well, you'll get it wrong more often than not. So I try to wait for some proof points, for some things that I can understand and things that people I respect understand. And even then, the best thing that I have going for me, I think, is a good instinct for knowing when to go meet people. But that even won't be good enough. And so in 2001, I had an hour-long meeting with the first business person at Google. His name is Omid Kordestani. He was called the chief business officer. He was the first MBA hired at the company. And they had just started this new thing called AdWords. Before that, they were making what little money they were making selling private label search to corporate websites, like running the search on Dell.com, for example. And he very patiently took me through his presentation, and there were these ugly gray boxes at the top and along the side, and he explained how we're running a two-sided auction for advertising keywords, and you bid on them, and this is how we're going to make money. This was months old. And he finished his presentation, and he said to me, "So what do you think?" I said, yeah, it's okay. That was a multi-$100 billion idea that I thought was just okay because I saw a lot of really interesting ideas. Excuse me. So I caught on, but never at the very beginning. Something I also was not early on, but am very proud of, is the work that I've done on Apple, starting in 2008 when Steve Jobs took either his first or one of his first medical leaves of absence. My editor and I were talking, and he said to me, "Well, what do you think will happen if Steve Jobs doesn't come back from his leave?" And I said, "Oh, well, that's pretty obvious. This guy named Tim Cook, who's the chief operating officer of the company, will be the next CEO." And my editor in New York, to his credit, said, "Oh, well, that's interesting. It's maybe obvious to you, but I've never heard of Tim Cook." I said, "Oh, that is interesting." So I did a profile of Cook that we called the genius behind Steve, when nobody in the business world had heard of Cook, because he was really Mr. Inside. And people in the Valley told me, "That's a crazy thing. No supply chain executive is ever going to be the CEO of Apple." So I had the last laugh on that one when he did become the CEO. A couple years later, I wrote a piece in Fortune that the working title was "How Apple Works." Steve Jobs had spoken off the record privately many times about his pride for how Apple operated, and that people didn't properly appreciate that. The reason people didn't properly appreciate it was that he didn't talk about it publicly. He was of two minds. He wanted people to focus on the products and only the products. That was part of the process. But privately, he was very proud of the fact that this was actually a very well-organized company with deep, deep talent and processes and culture. And I did a big story on that in mid-2011, which I relatively quickly turned into a book called Inside Apple. And very stressful, keep this in mind for my next topic, which I'll come to in a moment, is that I was very much writing a book in a news cycle, in what we would refer to as a news cycle. I knew Walter Isaacson was writing a biography of Steve Jobs, and I knew that Steve Jobs was dying. And we didn't know, nobody knew when, but we knew that it was going to be sooner rather than later. And so there was a sense of urgency to capture the essence of this company while the great man was still alive. I didn't make it in time. He died in October of 2011, and my book came out in January of 2012, which had the virtue of being able to have some closure and get that in. But the book was one of the first full-length treatments that said there's more to this company than this genius, this creative visionary, which he is, but it's more than that. And it asked the question, can Apple survive Steve Jobs? Again, I'm giving you a preamble to when I move to Uber in a moment where when you're writing a book, you're under tremendous pressure to make a call. And my editor and other people around me said, you got to make a call. Is Apple going to remain great after Steve Jobs is gone? And I was very conflicted. The smart people I talked to, the cynics, the Apple watchers said, no way, it's over. And I wasn't feeling that. And so I hit on two lines, two ways of describing the situation back in 2011, really, when I was finishing the book. One, I said, we have just witnessed in the time that Steve Jobs returned to Apple for after having left for that period of time in the 80s and 90s, we have just witnessed the greatest 15-year run of a corporation that we will ever witness in our lifetimes. If you think about the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, and throw in iTunes and a few other things in there, it is unlikely if Steve Jobs were to remain healthy that Apple would have another 15 years like that, number one. And number two, I do think it's safe to say that even if the company is no longer insanely great, which was one of his sayings, it will continue to be merely great. And looking back and looking at the most valuable company in the world and a company that can put on a show like they put on 2 days ago in Cupertino, I feel pretty justified that those, my two ways of thinking about it, hedged though they were a pretty good approach. So I set about, once I got over the pain of writing a book, it's a very, it's a bad idea for a man to have anything to say about childbirth, but I've heard many book authors compare the process of getting a book out to childbirth. It's very painful, and you don't want to contemplate doing another one, but eventually you forget, and you say, okay, I'd like to write another book. Again, I'm going to not even touch the other topic again for fear of getting myself in way too much trouble. But some of you have had a chance to read this email. I had known Travis Kalanick at Uber a little bit since 2010, and I decided, my editor and I decided that I was going to write a book about Uber. And the reason I wanted to write a book about Uber, I had succeeded by writing a book about a company that I thought was demonstrably the most important company in the world at the time, the most interesting, the most colorful stories, having the biggest impact, having a very charismatic leader, and what fit that bill in 2013, 2014, in my opinion, that was Uber. And so I told Travis Kalanick socially, or I should say, you know, verbally, privately, at various points, you know, I'd really like to write a book about Uber. And he said, yeah, you know, call me when you're ready, or let me know when you're ready. We'll see, which is what people say when you ask them to do anything that's going to require a lot of their time and effort. And finally, I can't tell if I put the date there, it's hard to read, but it's February 2014, I sent him an email. And I said, Travis, I'm ready. I'm ready to write a book about Uber. I've got a book contract lined up, and I'm ready to go. And this is what he wrote to me. I'm not sure if you're planning to write the book anyways, but I will make it clear to the folks I know not to cooperate. And if you are still persistent, I will find another writer to write an authorized book with full access to us to compete with yours. So my very first experience with writing a book about Uber was to be threatened by the chief executive officer of Uber. And you know, I put a title on my slide that says An Inauspicious Beginning. I actually, I think most people might think it was inauspicious. I don't believe that. I actually think it was auspicious because my very first interaction with Travis Kalanick over writing a book about Uber was to be threatened by him and therefore to have an anecdote for my book about what kind of person he really is. And this is the kind of person that he is. And it didn't particularly bother me, or I don't find this very off-putting, because although his threat was direct and menacing, a good journalist is sort of like a bull with the red flag being waved in front of him or her. You really want to run right at that red flag, and that's what I did. So let me tell you where Uber started, and then I'm going to go back even further, and then I'm going to bring you all the way forward to today. This was the original idea for Uber. It was a black town car, and we forget that now because Uber has become so much more. But initially, it was a bunch of guys who wanted to ride around town in style, and I'm going to sort of go into more detail about what the founding story was. But I want to tell you the fact is that I caught on to Uber slowly. I didn't really, I wasn't in the flow, and this great Silicon Valley companies are not started with big announcements and events the way Apple does, for example. They're generally started with a bunch of people writing some software code and mocking up a product and then saying to a few friends, hey, could you try the app that I just built? And then when a few friends try it, tweeting about it and saying, anybody who's following me, how about trying this app? And that might be a few hundred people. This is literally how Uber started. And the reason I start with a picture of a town car is that I first became aware of Uber because what's that? There was a group of 23-year-old young men living in the apartment above me in San Francisco, and it was not a pleasant experience for my wife and me because they kept different hours than we kept. And I have this abiding memory of the door slamming at 11 o'clock at night and seeing them walk down the sidewalk and get into a Lincoln Town Car that looked just like this. And I thought, I understand they're going out to bars or whatnot at 11 o'clock at night, which seems strange to me, but I guess that's what 23-year-olds do. But how is it that they're taking a town car? And I didn't understand it for a little while, and then it dawned on me. They knew about Uber, and I didn't know about Uber. And they knew about it through social channels, and I wasn't in those social channels. It took time for me to figure it out, and that's how these companies start. So let's dive into the story of this man who, is it safe to assume that everybody in the room is familiar with Travis Kalanick or no? No? Okay, great. So I find it fascinating who does and who doesn't know. He's a big part of my life because I wrote a book about his company. But in fact, he's just a guy who is an entrepreneur in San Francisco. And as I'll tell you in a moment, up until the time Uber became famous, wasn't even a particularly successful or well-known entrepreneur in San Francisco. But some contours of his life to help you understand how people go from nowhere to being infamous multi-billionaires. Middle-class kid from the San Fernando Valley, very bright in math and computer science, and also a decent athlete. So sort of bridged these worlds of, kind of a cool kid, but also a nerd at the same time. Goes to UCLA and falls in with a crowd of computer scientists. They hung out at a building in UCLA called Boulter Hall, which is only famous to a very few people in the world of government contracting because there was one of the two original DARPA nodes was in a room in Boulter Hall. And the computer scientists there are very proud of this and also very envious that nobody knows that they're in Los Angeles, and Westwood in Los Angeles was an important aspect of the DARPANet started because, I'm sorry, it was ARPANET, not DARPANet at the time. But the fact is, there was and there is a group of computer scientists at UCLA, undoubtedly less famous than at Stanford or at Berkeley or at various places in Utah, but outside of Silicon Valley and envious about that. And so Travis Kalanick was part of a group of undergraduates who dropped out of school after starting a company called Scour. Scour was a sort of pre-Napster. It was a way for college students initially just to share files, music files. They wanted to listen to each other's music. Keep in mind, they didn't own the music that they were sharing, and it was basically illegal to pass those songs around. But they were college students, and the networks were open, and that's what they did. This was before Napster, by the way. They got big enough and successful enough that they attracted the attention of the music companies, of the record labels, who filed suit against them for a lot of money and managed to close them down within 2 years. And so So Kalanick, who is in the middle, he's the cocky young man with his chin pointed up in the middle of this picture, and his friends were basically out of work and didn't have college degrees by around age 21, 22, and needed to figure out what they were going to do next. So, what is a hustling engineer who has worked on some technology that found some success but didn't work commercially for some obvious reasons? What do he and his friends do? They start another company. Bear with me on the description. The next company was called Red Swoosh. Red Swoosh was going to take the same exact technology that Scour had, a technology for sharing intellectual property files on a network, and legitimize it. Make it legal, and sell it to big companies like entertainment companies, like record labels perhaps, who wanted to move large audio and video files around the internet. Remember, this is ancient history. This is 2002, 2003. Broadband wasn't what it was, so you needed sophisticated algorithms and compression. My gag line here is that it was as if the drug dealer had become a pharmacist. They were going to take this illegal thing and make it legal. Red Swoosh largely didn't work. I have a long description of it in the book. It started with a handful of people. They got some venture funding. They got a little bit bigger. 9/11 happened. They were possibly going to be bought out by Akamai, which was smaller at the time. One of the co-founders of Akamai was coming to a meeting with them and was on one of the planes in 9/11 that crashed. The meeting didn't happen. They didn't get bought by Akamai. Their funding dried up. Things got so bad in the early 2000s that the company was down to Travis Kalanick and one engineer. And he kept it going. This became part of the lore of Travis Kalanick, that he would never give up. And finally, in 2007, he was able to sell the company for a relatively small amount of money to Akamai, so years later. And now it's 2008, to the middle of the financial crisis, and Travis Kalanick is living in San Francisco with a little bit of money in his pocket. And he's had a rough entrepreneurial experience with Red Swoosh. He was able to make it a small financial success for himself and some of his investors. And so what does he do? He buys a house and he calls the house the Jampad. This is not the Jampad. This is just to make you smile. But the Jampad was like a frat house for entrepreneurs. He would invite people over and say, let's jam on ideas. And I really like everything that he does is sort of unself-conscious. He doesn't do it because he's thinking about something historically, but it dawned on me that the name was interesting because an earlier generation in San Francisco, in the late 60s, the era of love and peace, people would come together and jam on music. But now, in the late 2000s, young people would come together and jam on ideas, not because they wanted to make beautiful music, but because they wanted to get stinking rich. And that is the ethos of San Francisco. And Kalanick fancied himself what is called an angel investor, but an angel investor with heart. He was going to spend 10 or 15 hours a week at these companies that he invested $10 or $20 or $30,000 with. Just so you know, that's considered a small, put some money on the table investment in San Francisco 10 years ago and today. And so he invested in quite a few of these companies and spent some time in them. Here's where Uber got started, and it wasn't with Travis Kalanick. It was with a guy named Garrett Camp, a Canadian entrepreneur who had started and very successfully sold a company called StumbleUpon. And Garrett Camp hated taxis because the San Francisco taxi market is a really terrible market. This is quantifiably true. It was hard to get a taxi in San Francisco compared with good taxi cities like Chicago or New York or Tokyo, and I would dare say even Washington from my time here was better than San Francisco. Camp had a hard time getting a taxi. He says he got blackballed by some of the taxi companies because he would call and ask for a cab, and then he would take the next one rather than one that he asked for. And he had an epiphany. And here's the most technical I'm going to get with you. This was 2008. Garrett Camp was aware of the technology that Apple was putting into the iPhone. The second iPhone had a GPS chip and an accelerometer in it. And Camp said, I could use that GPS chip and that accelerometer to create a kind of a dispatch system that would be in my pocket at all times, and that if I know where you are and how fast you're moving, I can create a billing and payment system as well. And so he had the idea of starting Uber. He hired some friends to do some web development for him to mock up what it might look like. He began talking to limousine drivers and playing around with the idea. There's a corporate story that Uber started when Garrett Camp and Travis Kalanick were at a conference in Paris, and it was a snowstorm, and they said, wouldn't it be great if we could just hit some buttons on our phone and have a taxi appear? That happened, but it wasn't how Uber started. Camp had already had the idea. He had already incorporated the company and filed for a website, ubercab.com, by the way. So why did Uber become such a success so quickly? I know I had this experience, and I think a lot of other people did the first time they took an Uber. Whether it was the limousine that I showed you earlier, which was where they started, or whether it was later what became known as UberX, they had this magical experience where they summoned the car. They could see where it was and when it would arrive, so no sort of standing on pins and needles waiting to know if you were actually going to be on time for your appointment or your plane trip. And when they were done with the ride, they got out of the car and didn't have to get out their wallet, fumble with a credit card, decide how much to tip. That's become very controversial, obviously, but you just get out of the car. It was like magic. And the other thing that was magical, and here I want to draw a through line for Travis Kalanick, from Scour to Red Swoosh to Uber. The brilliance, if you will, if this works, is that think about what Scour did. It built a business around the music that these college students didn't own. They owned some of it, but they didn't own all of it. And then Red Swoosh figured out a way, again, for companies to utilize a network to move around files, that some of which they owned, some of which they didn't own. Uber built a business by, first of all, not owning cars. Second of all, not employing drivers to drive them. And third of all, not following any rules, because rules didn't exist for what they were trying to do when they first started. So we think you should be regulated as a taxi company. Oh, I'm sorry, we're not a taxi company. As a matter of fact, we're going to change our name from Uber Cab to Uber to accentuate the fact that we're not a cab company, and your taxi rules don't apply to us. Now, long involved story about how the regulation developed, and it developed, and they started following rules, and they started hiring hundreds of lobbyists to make sure that they wrote the rules that when there would be rules. But this was a company that was built on technology. That's a server room for anybody who I hope it's a server room anyway. Not on going out and buying cars or interviewing drivers. By the way, that was the original idea for Uber. That was Garrett Camp's idea, and Kalanick's main contribution after coming on first as an advisor was to say, hey, you don't need to do that. Let's just think about these people as freelancers. Okay, so when Uber did get going, it started in San Francisco. It did guerrilla marketing to people like the rude young men who lived above me, and started to pick up traction. And then what they did was they moved to a few other cities, and they developed what they internally call a playbook. Every time they would go to a new city, they would take notes on what worked. They went out and met with journalists to get public relations. They would throw parties for drivers. They would hang out in limousine garages, or where taxi drivers would go get food or go to the bathroom and say, hey, we got this new thing called Uber, and they would buy people drinks, and not when they were driving, I'm sure, but and encourage them to drive for this new thing, and that became known as the Playbook. And they expanded initially in the United States. Los Angeles, Seattle, Chicago, Washington was a very early market for Uber, and relatively quickly to Paris, which I thought was interesting. It's very unusual for a Silicon Valley company to go international so early in its development. Why did it go international so early, and why was it able to? Well, it had this Playbook, but it also had the iPhone and the App Store. And I think we can't underestimate how important this was, that you could build a business, put an app on the App Store. The App Store is available everywhere in the world. And so long as you didn't need to worry about compliance and local regulations, which maybe they should have worried about but didn't, you were able to start a business very quickly. They also were innovative in how they priced. So remember, taxi companies around the world have regulated rates. And there's a flagpole, and that's what it's going to cost. Uber said that doesn't follow the laws of supply and demand. We're going to do something called surge pricing, which economists know as dynamic pricing. Airlines do it, hotels do it. But it was this, to many, this outrage that a taxi company would do it. But Uber's drivers loved surge pricing, and certain riders understood, I'm willing to pay a little bit more when the circumstances warrant it. Remember now, at this stage, we're in around 2012, Uber was black cars, was limousines. Along came another company in San Francisco called Lyft. I first noticed these cars driving around my neighborhood with a big pink mustache on the grill, and I had no idea what that was. Lyft had been in a different business. Lyft was truly in the ride-sharing business. They organized like ride-sharing routes for college campuses and corporate campuses. It's called Zimride. Business still exists. They actually sold it to Enterprise Rental Car. Then they had the idea of, they were watching what Uber was doing, and they said, you know, not everybody wants to ride around town in a limousine. Not everybody wants to feel like a baller, which was one of Travis Kalanick's favorite words to describe his customers. A lot of people would like a kinder, gentler relationship with the person driving their car. They might want to sit in front, not in back, and they might want to give a fist bump to their driver, who is like their friend. You know, I'm using this lilting language because that's how Lyft described it, and Lyft came along and started doing that. They started enabling just people with cars to drive other people around. Interestingly, Travis Kalanick wrote a white paper about this at Uber when Lyft came on the scene, and this is my little joke at him writing his pondering this situation of Uber had black cars, Lyft had ordinary people's cars, and he came to a conclusion: this probably isn't legal. We probably shouldn't do it. That didn't last very long because Lyft was growing so quickly, and it was clearly a very popular product. And Kalanick threw out his thoughts from his white paper and said, we're going to go all in. It's going to be called UberX, and UberX is going to be for everyone. So most of you probably didn't know that Lyft came up with the idea first, and I assume you didn't. And the reason is that Uber became much bigger than Lyft much more quickly. Why is that? Because by the time Lyft had this idea, Uber already existed around the country and around the world with its limousine service. And through very aggressive work and very cleverly, they were able to say, we're taking that existing network and we're shifting it into regular cars driven by regular people. I want to tell you quickly about one regular person with a regular car who drove for Uber, and that's me. That's not my 2002 Nissan Hunter Green Nissan Pathfinder, but I have one just like it. And I registered to become an Uber driver, so to do research for my book. And I just want to tell you briefly that I always had a romantic vision of driving a taxi. I'm from Chicago. I thought that taxi drivers are the people who know the way around town better than anybody, and that I would enjoy talking to my customers. And I think maybe I would have enjoyed it more in my 20s than I did in my late 40s, because I found it to be really hard, tedious work. Guess what? The people in the back seat ignore you. They would rather be on their cell phones doing emails, like me when I'm in the back seat of one of these things. And the pay wasn't very good either. But I'm glad I did it. I got to understand the company from the other side, which was unusual for a journalist. I got to see things like the driver app, which shows the driver which areas are surging. So and it did it in a very clever way by saying 2x, 3x in this area on a map. So guess what you do when you're a driver and you see where which areas are surging. You drive to the areas that are surging to make more money. I did it for 7 rides, in full disclosure. It was enough to decide that I didn't particularly like it. I had the Uber logo in my windshield. I found that the Uber logo in my windshield was incredibly stressful because it reminded me that I wasn't finished writing this damn book. And so once I finished the draft, I finally took the logo out of my window and breathed a sigh of relief. I also just, I have to tell you that my favorite ride was I drove my wife downtown and my daughter to summer camp. This was summer before last. And we sat in the front seat and she opened the Uber app and requested a ride. It was all but guaranteed that I would get the request because I was so close. That's the way it works. And then the two of them proceeded to criticize my driving for the entire ride drive downtown, but they did give me 5 stars, which I demanded, and to this day I have a perfect 5-star rating on Uber for all of my 7 rides. If you like, I'll tell you more about that. I just want to quickly show you. This isn't even Uber's most recent valuation. It's just a slide that I pulled to show some of the companies that Uber in its second to last private round of fundraising was more valuable than. We saw this sort of thing happen in the internet bubble too, by the way, back in 2000. There was a software consortium of the auto companies that was worth more money than all the auto companies. These things are, in a financial sense, are meaningless until they're tested in the public market. But directionally, it's interesting, and this is what Uber has become. I want to give you a taste of the future, and I want to start with a line that I found myself telling people earlier this year when my book came out in May. My friends would say to me, 2017, it's been an interesting year to finish a book on Uber. How much were you able to get in before you had to stop writing and publish the book? I said, I was able to get the first 17 scandals of 2017 into the book, but not numbers 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and so on. It's been quite a year for Uber. I want to just briefly tell you what some of them have been. Most of them are in my book. The most recent ones are not. So the #DeleteUber episode happened when Uber appeared to be breaking a boycott of taxis at Kennedy Airport the weekend that the Trump administration instituted a travel ban on the 7 Muslim-dominated countries. It's a little more complicated than that what happened, but it was a firestorm which resulted in Kalanick being the first chief executive to drop off of Trump's council, and this was before the council ever met. The Susan Fowler blog post, an ex-engineer at Uber, wrote a very damaging blog post about the environment of sexual harassment that she encountered at Uber, which led to a firestorm, which actually led to number 7, which was the report by former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder into what was going on inside of Uber. Grayball is this potentially illegal monitoring scheme that they ran to throw regulators off the scent. That's being investigated by the U.S. Justice Department. They have something like 5 of the most important executives in the company are absent from the company currently. Waymo litigation. Waymo, for those of you who don't know, is the new name for Google's self-driving car unit. They've sued Uber for allegedly stealing their trade secrets. That's going to trial in just a few weeks. Uber has failed in its efforts to settle that. There was this famous video of Travis Kalanick berating a longtime Uber driver who had a webcam on the dashboard. You'd think that after being on the cover of magazines and after being world famous for several years that it would occur to the typical CEO, maybe anytime I'm outside of my 4 walls, I should behave myself and not yell at somebody that might haunt me, but that's what happened there. And this story went from being bizarre to tragic when at the height of Kalanick being under pressure for all the various problems that the company had. His mother died in a boating accident with his father on a lake near where he grew up in Southern California. Just horrible, and he took a short leave of absence, which didn't take the pressure off him because he was, even amidst all this, he was fired several weeks later and was then sued by his biggest and most important investor, which is Benchmark Capital, one of the top venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. So, where does that leave us? I've written an entire book about a company that has become a verb, that became, in a relatively short period of time, one of the most important companies in the world, and certainly in Silicon Valley, and probably still the most highly valued private startup company in the world. I say all those hedge words because there's private companies that are bigger but have been around a really long time, and yet is under attack from all these corners. I'm an optimist. I started by telling you how I fought against the temptation of the smart people who told me that Apple was finished. They may still be right, by the way, but they won't be right for a little while. And I'm an optimist about Uber. The company has huge problems, but they have this global brand. They have a global operations. They have a lot of passionate employees. They have a lot of good ideas. They've been innovative both on technology and on business model, and they've just succeeded in hiring a world-class CEO who is the former CEO of Expedia. He's a former investment banker, so he's financially sound, he's operationally sound. He appears to be a very mature grown-up. And my #1 data point for that is that, and I hope this doesn't sound too self-serving, is that I've never met him. And what that tells me, he was in Seattle and he was in New York before that. That tells me it hasn't been terribly important to him to be schmoozing on the Silicon Valley cocktail party or conference circuit. He's the kind of guy who's been doing his job running his company. I think that bodes very well for Uber. So I want to tell the organizers of this event that I was very careful to follow your instructions not to click forward to the next slide, which has some sensitive information on it that has nothing to do with me. So I'm going to pause there and take any questions that you want to throw my way about Uber or anything else. Please.
So I just wanted to ask, I guess, the way I see it is as good their software developers were and as good the software is that they wrote, it is, to me, seems to be relatively trivial to build something like that. I think the real geniuses behind this company are the people who were able to build a business, which means for something like this to work, you have to have a critical mass of drivers and a critical mass of customers all at the same time like that. Because if you have a driver who tries to use it for a week and doesn't get any customers, you quit. The same thing goes with the customers. So how did they do it? Did they struggle? What was the secret? So I can never imagine how these companies get off the ground with when nobody knows them, and then all of a sudden you have to have a critical mass in order to be successful.
Yeah, that's a great question. So and I've heard the assertion, and I've heard them field the assertion about the software and the algorithms being trivial, and they take great issue with that. I can't debate it, but it's a fair point. I don't think it's trivial to make it all work with the payment systems and with the.
I'm sure it's very difficult.
I understand your point. Yeah. So at a high level, the Silicon Valley jargon for why this worked, why they caught lightning in a bottle, is this cliched expression about product market fit. They had a good product, as you say, and they had a great market, starting in San Francisco, where the moving people around market was really bad. So there was a great marketing opportunity, and so there was a fit, and. I think I come back to what I said before. They also had this amazing tool in the App Store that if you could get exposure, you were able to get the product in the hands of users very easily, very quickly, something you couldn't previously have done. All I can tell you is that market by market, they did a very good job of going viral quickly. They started by telling everybody in tech circles, say you got to use this new thing. Those people used it. Those people used social media a lot, primarily Twitter, and they got the word out. They got word of mouth out very quickly without spending a dime on traditional advertising, and it grew in a viral sense. They went and got and using things like surge pricing. Surge pricing had a wonderful effect at getting drivers to leave home and drive. That was their original reason for doing it, by the way. They had more demand than they had supply. So it's a great question. I fully acknowledge that we tend to look at these things backwards from they become successes and then we say why. It's an unsatisfying way of looking at it. That's my best shot. Yeah, Amr.
Adam, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Quick question. How would you contrast Travis and Steve Jobs?
Great question. I think that Steve Jobs did something he did an injustice for entrepreneurs everywhere in that he was a genius, a brilliant man who very often behaved badly. And, but it worked. It worked extremely well. And so, you know, I would talk to people, senior people, junior people at Apple would describe almost a form of a battered spouse syndrome where they would be berated, but they loved this man anyway. And they loved him because of his brilliance. He was right. He was almost always right. And even when he was wrong, he would then come around and say, oh yeah, that was a great idea that I thought of all the time. And the problem is I think he's given permission to other entrepreneurs who aren't Steve Jobs to behave that way. So Travis Kalanick has certain characteristics of Steve Jobs, but no one is Steve Jobs, and so he's not Steve Jobs. He doesn't have that ability to always be right. But what he does have, and this is the permission that I think Jobs has created, is to have this courage of saying, well, I'm doing great. This business is going really fast, and it's really working. And everyone's telling me it's really great. It's really working. So that excuses my being a horrible person here, and there because, well, it's working. And that's the mentality. I don't think that's the mentality in the Fortune 1000, but it is the mentality in Silicon Valley, and largely because of Steve Jobs. Yes, please.
I'm a happy customer with the Alexandria yellow cab. I never had the need to use Uber. I saw an interview of Travis before the Susan Fowler came forward, and his personality, his attitude, I just didn't like it, and something about him made me feel I don't trust this guy. I'll never use Uber. Then all of these scandals happened, and I felt validated about it. And I know all the problem they had with their culture. I wonder how, and this maybe touches Amer's question, how does the culture with Apple and Uber compare now that he's out? Or my other question is, why doesn't the taxi companies make a similar software for people to track, where their cab is? If that seems to be the appeal, it's just knowing that a cab is coming. What's stopping them from doing that?
So it's too soon to answer on the first question. The culture hasn't had a chance to change, I don't think. The new guy's been in there for 2 weeks. Kalanick hasn't left, by the way, which will be an interesting ongoing story. He's a major shareholder and a board member, and this new guy, Dara, I can't say his last name. I haven't practiced saying it yet. It's a long Persian name. Very cleverly gave a comment to the press where he said, "Well, of course why would I not want Travis's input?" I think that was a clever way of neutralizing Travis. We'll see if it works. Who knows? Taxi companies have tried to have their own apps. So in San Francisco, for example, they have an app, and it works. But they still have problems. They have structural problems. So for example, the number of medallions in a city like San Francisco or New York is capped. The beauty of Uber is that nothing was capped. So the beauty of it from a consumer perspective, if we need 40,000 today, we'll have 40,000. If we need 60,000 today, we'll have 60,000. And if the next day we need 20,000, there'll be 20,000. And then there's the capital investment. Again, these taxi companies have to buy taxis, and they have to put their drivers through, I don't know if it's a W-2 or not, but they have to put them through their HR process. And so they have all these structural issues that many, many legacy companies and many other industries have that make it difficult to fight back against an upstart like Uber. You should at least try Lyft so that you can get the experience of the magical experience. I totally appreciate if using Uber is never going to be your thing. It's fine with me, by the way. Yes?
Adam, thank you. If you could invest $1,000, would you invest in Uber or would you invest in Apple going forward?
In what, I'm sorry?
Apple or Uber?
Going forward. Well, so first of all, I've transitioned in my career a little bit, but at the you're the finance guy, right? Is that, yeah. How could you guess? But when I first got to the Valley, I covered the capital markets every day, and so a few things happened to me. One, I had a policy of never investing in individual stocks. I didn't want to have any conflicts of interest. I also became an extreme Bogolian. I'm an acolyte of Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard, and I'm a huge believer in passive index investing because I covered the markets, and I know that most professional investors are very bad at it. So you see how I'm hedging on your question. You didn't say at what valuation, right? Even going forward, there may be an opportunity to invest in Uber at a much lower valuation than $69 billion, which was its last funding round. So, but if I were a betting man, which I'm not, I would invest in Apple at this current valuation rather than Uber at its valuation, because interestingly, you could do a whole magazine piece on this. Apple is almost always trades at a discount to the rest of the market, and the reason is it's the most valuable company in the world. It's very hard to grow a company that big. And there's all this bias that their best innovative days are behind them. I haven't looked at they've had a run recently. They're up quite a bit recently, but for quite a while they were trading for something like 12 times forward earnings, which compared with 15 or 16 for the S&P 500, which was insane. So that's how I'd take the bet. I'm not saying I think Uber's going to collapse, but let's say the execution risk is higher. There's no execution risk essentially for Apple right now. Sure. Please.
Do you think that the iPhone X or 10 is
10, right.
more valuable than the 8 Plus?
Is it? Your question is it $200 more?
What should I get?
$200 more valuable, right? I'm sitting. Well, first of all, how badly do you need a new phone? When do you want to get a new phone?
I've had my current one for 2 years. So
Yeah, because you might not.
I don't want to do the payment.
Right.
I'd rather just own my phone.
Okay. And you might not get a 10 by Christmas. You might not. If you go order on October 27th, they're going to start shipping on November 3rd. You might not be one of the fortunate few to get it. But at November 3rd to December 25th, you'll probably get it by Christmas. So I'm fascinated by your, I'm not going to, I have a 6S. I'm not, my company's too cheap to get me a 7. I do wonder, why would you, if you can afford an $800 8, why wouldn't you spend the extra $200 to get a 10? One reason is that the 10's going to be a little glitchy. I don't have an Apple Watch either, and I interviewed Tim Cook 2 weeks ago, and he first thing he does, he said, "Well, I see you're not wearing an Apple Watch." He said, "What's that thing?" He looked at my Fitbit. He said, "What's that?" I'm getting close to wanting an Apple Watch because I'm the kind, I want the second, third, fourth generation. So that would be, do you need to, if you have this, if it's a social status thing, look at me, I got a 10, then you absolutely got to have the 10. It's going to be super cool.
On that note,
the wireless charging, it's going to be super. Oh yeah, okay. So I'm hearing you now. You want an 8, yeah, 8 plus. But here's the thing: you're also going to get the most memory, right? Because you don't want to get the lower memory. That's not $800. I'm pretty sure that's $900.
yeah.
That's a tough call. But you can get it. You can get it immediately. You can have it. What, in 2 weeks, 3 weeks? Okay. Good luck.
Adam,
I've got her riding Lyft. I've got you buying an iPhone 8, no commission.
Adam, thank you.
You got someone who's
One
just
more.
dying for.
Okay, one more.
This is probably going to be the one that brings
Last
me
question.
down.
Yeah, last one, softball. So given
Okay.
the topics, I think in order to substantiate your credibility here, we really need to get your thoughts on Silicon Valley,
Okay.
the show.
Oh, the show. The show. Thank you. Yeah. When the show first came out, the first season, I heard about it. I read a little about it. I saw the promos. And I can't remember. I should go back because I tell this story a fair amount. I should go back and get the specifics on when exactly that was and what exactly was going on in my professional life at the time, because I was way too stressed out to watch the show. I said, I don't want to watch this show that is going to make me feel like I'm reliving the day I just had. You know, I don't watch Game of Thrones, but I want to because Game of Thrones has very little to. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's pretty Game of Thrones-ish, but you know what I mean. Like I need some fantasy, some escapism in the evening time when I'm watching television. So I didn't want to watch Silicon Valley. My wife started watching and she said, "This is so funny. You got to watch it." So I missed the whole first season, but HBO makes it so easy to catch up. So when the second season started, I binge watched season 1, and I loved it. It is so real, right? So my wife and I are watching the show, and I'll say, "Oh, well, you know who that is that they're making fun of? That's so and so." So they create these composite caricature characters that hew very close to the real people. I should tell you, my wife works at Google, and so we refer to Google at home as Hooli, because again, it is only a tiny exaggeration what goes on at Hooli that goes on at Google. So you know the things with like, it's almost like laugh out loud realistic with the guy, the big head character who goes and they tell him to go up on the roof. You know, you're just going to be on the roof now, and you go up on the roof and there's bouncing balls and great food and streamers, and it's really like that. So thank you for asking.
So please join me in saying thank you to Adam. Great job.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.